Saropi Rail Temilo Tiablo YouTube Lama can live dona.
Okay.
I can host Kanner on it's home young.
Ole.
Tifana YouTube lang tu kan tifal tu eh. Cuman bis mana kan? Oh.
Yes, welcome everyone. We will start the session in a minute. We're just waiting for the VC to come online. We will be giving the welcome address, so please bear with us. We will start the session in a minute. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you who have taken your time to attend the first session of day one of the International Webinar Week of ICFA University, Mizoram. The webinar schedule has been laid out for the entire week, and I would like to invite everyone to feel free to attend the upcoming sessions on the other days of the week as well. Before we proceed further with the session, and today being the first day of the International Webinar Week, I will now call upon our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor R.P. Vadera, to deliver a 10-minute welcome speech.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me all. I, Professor R.P. Vadera, the Vice Chancellor of ICFA University Mizoram, welcome all the participants as well as the resource persons of today's seminar. Before I go into elaborate my welcome address, I must, on the onset, congratulate the organizing team led by Dr. Lalthanpui Silo, the academic coordinator of the university and the convener of this international webinar series that we are going to start today. And I also would like to congratulate to other organizing team members, Secretary Dr. Lalthanpui Pui, Department of English, Treasurer Wanlalom Kimi, HOD Education, and Mr. Wanlal Sean Moya, who has been providing the technical assistance. I'm very pleased to see the brochure of the webinar series, and it has been planned very well. And the themes that have been taken, they are also very contemporaneous, relevant in the context. And as far as today's webinar is concerned, you're all aware about the theme. Theme is on human rights and their representations in literature. But then before I go into the details of this, let me also introduce to the participants that we have series of international webinars starting today with this particular theme. Then we have tomorrow another theme which relates to border issues in Northeast. Then we have another theme that is relating to youth and mental health. The third theme, and the fourth theme is relating to tourism and inclusive development. And the last one is there on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, their use in education, health, and the business. So this is about the series. So this will conclude on 28th. Today we have one theme, which I have already shared with you. And tomorrow he is going to be there on border issues in Northeast, and then youth and mental health. This is contemporaneous issues and emerging responses. So that this will happen. So I do first of all congratulate the team as well as the host of today's webinar. The convener, the coordinator is Dr. Rodi Laramoy, HOD English, and then his assistant coordinators are Ms. Pauline from English department, as well as Mr. B. Lalmonpuya, the HOD Mizo department. So friends, I am pleased to know about the whole series and the way this has involved all the departments as far as today's theme is concerned. So it is being hosted by, coordinated by Department of English and Department of Mizo. Tomorrow we have this border issues in the Northeast, three departments, Department of Political Science, Department of Geography, and the Department of History. They are coordinating that the program. And the next day, third day, that is on 27th, we have this youth and mental health. This is being coordinated by the Department of Education and the Social Work. And then we have a team on this tourism and inclusive development. This is coordinated by Department of Economics, Commerce, and tourism, travel and tourism. And the last theme, that is on artificial intelligence and emerging technology, their use in health, education, and business. this is being coordinated by the Department of Management and IT. So I find that this organization, the theme selection of themes and the host departments are following that matching is wonderful. And I congratulate all of you, those who have done this exercise. At the same time, friends, I welcome today's our external resource persons, those who are here with us today. We have today 3 themes on which we will be having our discussions. And the first theme is there on unsilencing rhomboid voices. That is the first theme. And the second theme is there to be presented by our external resource person, the speaker, Dr. Shreshika Dishani Piasena. So she is going to make her presentation on a very, very interesting topic, depictions of the female militant and suicide bomber in literature. So I can understand that although she has worked formerly there as a senior research associate at the City University in Hong Kong, but presently she's placed in Colombo, Sri Lanka. I think this topic, will be very interesting. For us, it will give us a totally different kind of perspectives. So we all understand, I think, the background in which this might have happened. So we know it, 80s, the mid 80s, or maybe the late 70s, that the movement that we had there in Sri Lanka, I think, so maybe this is what she would like to, I think, share her understanding on this particular theme. And she has been a very, ferocious writer. She has contributed lots of poems to different anthologies. And her areas of interest are gender, the war, then the violence, and the films. These are the areas of her interest. War and violence, I think this certainly fall under, even the gender, I think human rights, when it comes to her calling this, or maybe she might have been taking care of these human rights issues there in this area. Then we have a very prolific writer, Professor Pramod Kumar Nair, who is at present teaching there in the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. He has a wide range of publications, lots of books, essays, and other literary works to his credit. His more recent work, I will be citing 1 or 2, is there on human rights, graphics, and novel, routledge publication, essays in celebrity culture. So this he has published very recently in 2021. Both the publications are of 2021. And today I was browsing the internet, so I found one of his articles, which is very well fitting into the today's theme. The theme of his article, which I have seen today, he has published there in 2020, last year, in maybe somewhere in February. The theme of the article is human rights and literature. And I'm sure that his presence today in this particular webinar, having almost the same theme on which he already might have done many more publications. Okay, so this his presence will further raise the level of discussions in this particular seminar. Friends, I know human rights is a very big theme. It's not possible or falling to this to cover it within such a small time span, 2 to 5 hours, 2 to 2 to 5 p.m. within 3 hours. But then I find that all the topics that this non-silencing, this is the rhomboid voices. I think that relates to the struggle and the sufferings of the Mizo society for those 2 decades from 1966 to 86. And majority of you, the participants who are there with us today, they were maybe not born or falling, they were very young in that particular period. They have not experienced those sufferings of 20 years, 2 decades. But I had some experience. I joined Mizoram in 85, almost 8-9 months before signing of the peace accord on 30th June 1986. I had joined in 1985. And those 8.5 months that I experienced, I came from Punjab, which had suffered from terrorist activities, and from maybe late 70s to 1985. The peace accord in Punjab was signed in 1985. Even in Assam also, peace accord signed in 1985, and Mizoram peace accord signed in the mid of the 1986. Those 8.5 months before the signing of the peace accord, I could see while coming back. I was there in Pachunga College. Evening when I used to come back, but the last the college bus, there used to be curfew. Curfew used to start from almost 4:30. The whole city was used to be taken over by the paramilitary forces. Following, people had to close down their shops by 3 o'clock, 3:30. They had to go back home, and there was all this military movement and the paramilitary movements all around. Okay, but I can imagine the suffering of the people, those who had remained under curfew for almost 20 years. So we cannot understand their sufferings. Okay, and I had experienced curfew when Blue Star operation had happened in Pakistan, in Punjab. It was also somewhere in June 1984. It was only for 7 days curfew in the whole of Punjab, and we were fed up with the 7 days curfew. But you can imagine the situation of the Mizo society, the people here, that 20 years they had to remain under curfew, this night curfew starting from 4 o'clock to the morning or following. So I can understand, I think this theme, unsilencing the voices of this rhomboid voices. I think lots of writings have come up. Even I had my own colleague there in Mizoram University, Professor Margaret Zama, who has been sharing with her views with us on this particular theme. And I have gone through it, some of her writings there on the internet. But I think this, to understand the perspective, the complete, the history from different perspectives of that particular movement, of the people suffering. So I think we need to, non-silencing of rhomboid voices. I think this is, interesting, going to be very interesting. I think this will give us a very more holistic understanding of those sufferings. Yeah, I know that in Punjab also, when this terrorist movement was going on for maybe 10, 12 years, 15 years, lots of people suffered and have been killed from both sides are falling. From paramilitary sources, maybe different communities are falling. But the same thing might have happened at much longer period, during much longer period in the Mizoram, okay? So therefore, this particular theme, maybe me, I have experienced it first time. I have been attending lots of seminars on human rights education sponsored by National Human Rights Commissions there within the Mizoram universities and elsewhere. So friends, I don't want to take much of your time. I have been given only 7 to 8 minutes. So I congratulate the organizers. I welcome especially our external resource person, especially our lady resource person, Sureshika Piasena. So she has given, upgraded the status of this seminar to international, because she's from Sri Lanka, and she had also been there in Hong Kong for some time. I think she will this. At the same time, we have Professor Pramod Kumar Nair, who is a very senior professor and who has done lots of writing on this particular theme. I do welcome all the three resource persons, especially even our local resource person, Dr. Sila Ompuyavantiya. So I welcome all my colleagues, the students, the participants from other colleges. I know lots of teachers from the Mizo department, English department, as well as from other departments like political science and history and sociology, economics, from the various affiliated colleges, as well as from the Mizoram University, and maybe from outside Mizoram, they might have or got registered with this particular theme. And I wish that that seminar will come out with some important recommendations, because the themes are quite interesting. So with this, I once again welcome all of you, and I extend my thanks to all those who have directly and indirectly participated in planning this international webinar series. Thank you so much. I wish all of you good luck the seminar, this webinar to be a grand success. Thank you so much. God bless all of you.
Thank you, sir, for the warm welcome speech. And now we will proceed on with the session. As highlighted in the webinar schedule, and as mentioned by our respected VC, today's session is jointly organized by the Department of English and the Department of Mizo and Cultural Studies. And today we are really fortunate to have three distinguished academicians as our resource persons. We have Dr. Sila Ompuyavantiya and Dr. Sureshika Piasena and Professor Brahmotkin Nair. And as mentioned before, the theme for this session is human rights and its representation in literature, and our three resource persons will present papers on different aspects of human rights as represented in literature. This theme has been carefully chosen while keeping in mind contemporary political, social, and cultural issues, and how emerging trends in literature have responded to these problems. So we hope to, we hope to highlight the representation of human rights violations as a social problem, and to point out how reforming society is both urgent and necessary at the same time. So the papers presented in this webinar will explore this dilemma by focusing on the intersection between human rights advocacy and the various cultural forms that explicitly attempt to participate in human rights discourse. So our first speaker for today is Dr. Sila Ompuyavantiya, and I think we can say that he is one of the most renowned scholars that we have in the Mizo literary circle, particularly in regards to Rambai studies, where he have made invaluable research contribution. And I think we're all familiar with his masterpiece, Rambai Literature, which was published in 2014. And apart from this, he also has other notable works like Tapsak Theory, which was published in 2011. And After Decades of Silence, published in 2016, which he co-authored with Professor Margaret Tozama. Today, Dr. Lal Ompuya will be presenting a paper on the topic titled Unsilencing Ramboy Voices. And before I hand over the time to our resource person, I would like to request everyone to have your audio on mute so that we can have a smooth session without any noise interruption. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask or any comments and opinions that you would like to share, please feel free to post them in the chat box here or send it to me as a direct message. Or if you want, you can always unmute yourself and ask the questions live after the session. And after the end of the 3 sessions, our resource person will respond to these questions and queries collectively. So this is also a request to our resource persons to stay on with us till the end of the 3 session. And I'd also just like to add that e-certificates will be available for all the participants. So please make sure that you fill out the feedback form, the link of which will be posted at the end of the session. Dr. Opia, if you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Well, good afternoon to you all. I am very grateful to the organizer for this arrangement, and today I'm feeling quite fortunate to share the same platform with renowned scholars like Dr. Surasika Piyasena and Professor Nair. This is highly a great privilege. Well, I'm not intended to expand the meaning of my chosen topic as it will unravel itself as I proceed. However, the Ramboy part refers to the MNF or otherwise Mizo National Front movement of 1966 against the Indian government. The aftermath of the movement, its subsequent repercussion, its subsequent consequences, wherein the innocent victims, the innocent people who stood in between the hammer and the anvil, the hammer of the Indian security forces and the anvil of the MNF volunteers were the voiceless victims. Today, I will attempt to highlight such voiceless victims. And as today's program is coordinated by jointly by the Department of English and Department of Mizo, I am given a kind of permission, a kind of freedom to pick the language I prefer to present my talk. So I will switch to local dialect, and I'm very sorry that if this create a kind of inconvenience to participants who might not follow the local dialect. Anyway, unsilencing the Ramboy voices, the Kansoydona, Amasain, Mizo Ram University, Noya B.S. July, second semester, BM Mizo July, Hian La Anzira, Sumi Anla Zira, Chuan, section Pakata, Ram Ngai La, Ti Oma, Chu Ram Ngai La, Chuan La Patum, Rokunga La, Harla Tite, Swakliana La, Kokom La, Tite, Tin Vitang Zama La Po, Tola Ding the Che Tite, Kanhua, He Kokom La, he Swakliana Middle, La Po Tiam, Lian Pui, Kotsuak, Vanzao Kua and Kom Lu, in Apuania, Apuachan Takpo, he Aten Natimela, and Vabel Ate, Chen Omami, who Ze Vanzi Kanu Pisong Chuamin, Kahulai until Tonte La Apua, Changlet Herten and Laura, Vonatan Le, and Hunton, Danglam Tak, Sinsiana, Atan Khan Po, Turin, Atia, Aninataka, Chuan Helahi, Lunga in a room, Atranga, Patian and Ona La, Trong China La, Ani, Tintola Ding the Cheti Po, he, the Puni coin, Zaitian Valal Silo, Te Zoram Sanitan and Ansakpo, Chuan, political party, platform Minamin Mutir Tumdana, Chuan in Hemi, Indian Security Force Le, Mizo, in Karatil Kling Anga, Night Turin, Bowo, Kansium Trina, Tutsu, the Aninataka, Chuan, Vitang Zamahianin, Tiliam to Chunga Kubala, Tulona Tura, in Somna La Ani, Achanchu Ramabuaya. Ama avanga sipain min vuak tite ama wanga hekatok ama wanga pachung ten thi pana ama wanga inle lo ka chan di ang chi kha ang chi phupala phuba kanin lak ton lo na tura adu thu sam la ani amara chu tun huwa kan po fan dan le kan project dan na chu adang ta ni engponi se hela pathum jing la pani ko khom la kan ti te thola ding ta che kan ti ang chi te hi torna awanga lo piang ani human rights violation of wanga torna kan ti te tuarna kan ti te channa retheina van doina thina heng zong zong zirzawi voina kan webinar thupui human rights and its representation in literature ina atum chuni atoizong in soitaila human rights literature chon nimal zalenna dignale chanvo in rabe sak angai thupui le a human rights choinuna choivula chu associate le a moral duty a arot ani artistic beauty ti temo artistic representation ti temo artistic expression ti lampang kha human rights literature chuan athupui ve te chiam lo a tin he human rights literature huanga ziami te mo purna hi asang le a achan chu mi la shet ngai lo te mi la soi ngai lo te minan la zia ngai lo te khovel ma a porchok tu anni awangin poison po ngai le a ani na taka chuan crusader ani na chen te po a om ve ni an literary creation mangin hemi human rights literature huanga a writers te an literary creation mang in social change social awareness athen theya chu an kowa mo phuna rit tak ain ngata chumi pialama chuan thil poimo pakhat tak chu aziak tu te an poimo rolin thil moi poimo tak khat chu alo dong song tu ashir tu te na an lo don sundana khan ain ma thui le bok ani tin literature manga atur tu te torna phor chu ani hian an torna kha Kenton Dile at the Pope and Ngai Mate, Maro Chu, Action Montolo, Natura, Ochu, and a Zo, and literature, literature to machine experience, machine torna, one suana, ani. The Alama, a tour to the torna can lo shit, young be a tinkolo say, condition boca, tin swal what not the Pope means your dear Bocani. Here, literary genre, human rights literature, he, French philosopher. John Paul Sartre, What is Literature, 1948, published at Purso and Lakan, engaged literature, Tivel, Asoyatranga, Hang Idaniran, Piang Chokalia. He French philosopher in Idana, to oppressed minority groups, he and also on the space platform and to literature, he Atiani, literature, Mangin, oppressed and in the can also put here, social change and clean put here. Tin action bonnet hey at the end amar chukha action ka pubalag at nge writing mga anmani din hun also we khange enge action chu asoi to chongwa tin he human rights literature hi a concept amo as a literary genre anga khovel ma aron impose on tak tak chu sang hi somvel chok khani alano bang le ani tin khotlang rama chon Harper Lee zia Tukile Mockingbird tite American Civil War malama loads of the Uncle Tom's cabin HB stories ang teka human rights literature huanga le kabu novel soilar to tachunita Harper Lee le kabu ahian America rama racism racial discrimination chung sang te a aucho pita tin Uncle Tom's cabin po slavery chatlo na te po kan huta tin heng ba kahin Toni Morrison beloved tin Franz Kafka, The Trial, dito po kan mubok ta heng lo po say to tamtak umin arin pom ani tin heng ho tuziak and creative writing and creative works pena til pakat kan hu so freedom of expression ani bokta ka freedom of expression mangkhan mi hersan na kan tidon nge voiceless voice ka anon also pe anon represent ta ani ke mani Mizoram context bi ka chon kan ram boy awanga thule na lo chuak Ramboy literature te kan say ta huanga tuarna ite mimal zalen na inra besa na angchi te aton to na mi puito na angchi khang angchi thuzia top so he human rights literature hian phung lu the vet ani voina kathupui tema topic karon sop so tifia turian thupui pali pangavel karon sop so ama sabera chuan sexual harassment, sexual violence, chungchang, konsaiso kadua, rape di handa, tol me khat lelama chonan wam chia lo pagatin heng til pakhat hansoi fia le til dang point dang hansoi fia na nichina hanai na aron sei to kale kabu 2014 Ramboy literature ka ti so ka refer zo don he sexual harassment hi Mizoram Ramboy ka 1966 at 1986 thing khan athing ani Mars nili Zana kami reinforcement Mountain Brigade Masimpur Silchar tanga ron chuak cho vai reng te bil ko thir te ron theng cho zela scholarship andri zan mars nili 1966 ana changkan pongsual sexual harassment hi antrana anasa hanti khan nasatak ani kale kabu 2014 na kati chu khan khwa veng mun somsari pasari ka identify 2014 nuwa le kabutam ta chuak to a han ngai to ma ula athen namun hi za khoza chuang ani arim oma ani ta da chon somsari pasari ka identify hian khop ani chon e kan ko hian a thleng lo wan ti amar chu be chan ne ziak kania imponi se chulai chu thushan ni ta se hemi conflict zone kan ti mo conflict situation a reng reng chon me che taksa hi indonamual a site of battleground, a site of battlefield. So ani train ani chumina a enter chumina a represent to honor, dishonor ani power and powerlessness anga so ani bok ani enter nan Second World War Japanese occupation China te abigin Korea anga te hemi sexual harassment hi adwar German copy Berlin afola Russian occupation chung rap thak kopin atleng bokani henga te hian rape kanti sexual harassment sexual terrorism hi ne na entir tu angai ani mase atur tu tan chuan chutiang ngot chu ani thei silo ani entir nan Korean nu ho Japanese howina comfort women an mang comfort station na an po lu nom chen na ta na anti sa cha na ship tha na an man lu ho Korean nu ho voin thing hian Seoul Japanese embassy ma lung oil na 1992 tang khan an lalan tir ani chutiang chu thil omdan ani engemo kan nena entir nang kan han thia rise a practical chuanin kha om thei ani lo ani engponi se ke mani Mizoram ramboi context a khan lu le taila ramboi kuma khocha pathil seng pakati han soi ka du Indian security force tena mass rape mulcheng ko thing chung changa khalaya khan sang ka jakwa somruk paruk kum toblama he thil hi athenga chuta chuanin he mass rape hian me che pani in real relama har satna anneya pakatchu tuna sai tuala anaute bula ko sa pakathi soi tamela is lungdar ko thian ama po hi ka mu to numel thata no tak ani amaro chu real relama kan har satna nei ti kha achiang renga chu he real relama har satna an nei ma hian a in puanga sizama le khabu antol atrocity sa hian a in puanna zialan ani page 146 ahian hetiang hian a in zekani this is something before she became totally insane yeah that John hetiang hian soya when I recall my memories that dreadful and terrible thing which happened to me that night is still very clear in my mind. I still tremble with fear whenever I recollect it. Anger and hatred come to me again, and then tears flow down from my eyes. I am now a miserable, poor, and helpless girl. All my virtues and virginity had been taken away by evil soldiers. I would like to die much more than to live a worthless life. I ask God why He has given me the gift of memory to remember that dreadful night. I ask God why He has given me the gift of memory to remember that dreadful night. I really hate memories. Oh, I hate memories. And she wept bitterly. In her case, memories is very painful. Memories is very traumatic. It's a nightmarish kantitayang so mangsi angin aron umzui le china atan chuan memory akha rap of me akha adam na zo ani chu hemite pani hi rilula mahar sana nei hi ex MNA in India Sarkar zang adom na peturin anboy puya kung sang ni sompali khan anakaw na nuai nga ve anon thun sak ani panina hian voiceless voice kong kharmoi chungchang hi soile kadua hi 2013 khan Zo Life magazine voiceless voice how long nula khongai thla kong kharmoi tin ka ziak to tin kong kharmoi story hi khacheng turin 2013 kumlai hol khan how long ka jing nge kong kharmoi te hi chung ko claim ania anu le pa ba ka anaw nen an kusla leilet bufai leilet ne an ni vain e barlama harsa na an tok lo chungin pur turin abuminan bumchuaka lai soral lama te was kon pilama te an tala he apur pui pilal buki new how long an te sai chho an tipoka ta son aladamin karinga chumile haunau tenen purpura ankal an holam pang ahi salai bora MNF sub area DC amin chu sei lo mela chumi ho chuan an lo mana an lo shrem vai angai zong vai agent ani chu ho ve thelo achung thu kan rel don ti in an lo chil tin a thian te po kha engma sei lo turin an vo boka ti chuan ram hnuaya kar ni an ompui chung hian how long khotlang le to shanin le kha an tlan tira kong khar moi hi rin le na tur am lo nu la thiang hlim nu la fel ani kongai takin chuaru an ti hemi le khatlan pui tu hi ama kong khar moi pur tura bum chuak tu bok khania hepa ina athuran hon chu khar moi ka mu thelo ti bak ron hon anei lo ani ti chuan khar moi hi kar ni nuwa anda thata tila an tongkam ho ila tiang chuan athina hian haulong khot pui haulong khotlang angor na sale haulonga an na kung pui pakhat ro ta tan an chen omnu time ila kharmoi tan hian len tu pui ramdaya tila apo sak ani hen lai hi hau kharmoi nu hian kharmoi nu deng chung ral te hian kolaya sakshina at pui lo chongani alung leng lu tu awak vel ruwa ya anu le pa hi kharmoi nu le pa hi anu an chena tin anaw hi jeep accident a boral heng he tun a pe chon anin omna la ya in ding om to lo tiang kha anin apa hian dupui dang ane ya mun dang a in sana rota tana kharmoi tana la po chu he tiang hini ami an famna chu run nuama len rual lung du te an leng ke kanau thafamna run lo len tu pui nuaya chamang azalta oi analua lung len minhan ngai ve hian karing thrine ti ani omzia chu mi chu an thi an mani ina an run nuama ke kanau thafamna chu run lo len tu pui nuaya chamang azalta ti ani hen hai hi ni erota te hen lo po hetianga hla alo omahi ale lama chon kharmoi story nem het tu thatak ani kale khaburam boy literature hi kharmoi tan ka dedicate he a lungchem rama lalbuang lo mong zuang thing on huaya khan khur po laisak lo tui hok lon kora anzar ta mai kharmoi kha o tu mana an shet mai to lo bolen tur kha hetia kale khabua kan dedicate hian atharau vak vai chona zonga vak ri thin ka thamung takin ha dam taka achol kha karing tatani chu ka feel dan ani bok ani kale kabuti chu atranga thariat nu along tlai tangin phone call ta donga me che pakhatin min ron bia kan u kharmoi chanchin iron ji ka kan lom le tu athalak te iron nem kaya kan lom le tu kania an ron tian chu voiceless voice present abo rock on da chu ani pathumna hian ramboy fiction ma feli lalrem moina kumsang hi soma hil har kan tur ti azia hi hansoile ka chaka ramboy chungchang hemi ramboy narratives kan ti hian thuang ni lian deuh mai oma pakhat chu MNF narratives ania pakhat chu non MNF narratives ani ta MNF narratives chuan MNF ramului ho an ramut chanchin ngai nom tak tak ji an tek oma chumi ep chuan non MNF narratives on vele ta MNF ramu velem lo te ma ram boy experience ho ina anji ana caution point of view te poniang kotlang point of view te poniang sarkar na tokina an point of view te poniang chung chu ombok ta chumi ba pila ma chon creative writing sa hi on vele ta chu creative writing sa chuan hemi hla ramboy songs ramboy hla hi tam tok tak zathum zali vel chuang omani chumi baga chuan drama hi pathum pali vel omle bok chu baga chuan ramboy fiction hi short stories ti amin kale kabu hen som nga le pathum ka identify ya lo identify mai te po kaneatin sa hi som palin wa le budam tam taka choga hanai when black butterfly ti te po kha English azia te oma chu lo po chu adang English azia te po oma tiang chuan le khabu hemi ramboi fiction be kan ron chu ron piang om zel bok atlang pui tu in heng ramboi fiction kan han ti te azir tu te love story ang do zulzin nula tangwal in mga ina ang chi de bian ang zir de zela intinan zik pui pan na pong thuam pui kan ti ang te po college sa introduce ani chuan kan ute ho ina an zir te dan chuan nule ra tangwal in mga ina amar in mga ina kal kong tur ramboi na ti boi tak chuta an mga ina le an mani nung shim pir si ta angin an project ramboi studies lampang ani na kha an ngai tu phalo nge khalam pangjong khan khur ani ngai lo ani engpon is he hil har kan tur ma felizia a he ramboi fiction ke mai na cheer veti to china chuan ala expressive ber ala explosive ber bokatin a representative ber boka tren khat chuan hanchias ava bias vete bokan thime the amar chu narrative pakhat omsa nilozonga zia narrative dang oma chu a bias kan timete mar thilni ti balance ve angaya chu tiang point of view atanga azia chu ani te po arin oma emponi se hele khabui me china a me chet puite digna chanvo a au chopina an thlawang a ho sakna ani a an me cha thlawang ho sakna ri po aring le ani tin he nilhar kan tuara hi is lungdar khobe chana zia ani a kumsang khazakwa samru paru kumtopa lungdar kho hal kho kan thu kan hrianga chuta kho halani chante athendante halani chante khang kha min tler pui a tunaya zoneta captain lal thana ankom na te ko kan entry in arin ama chuta chuan pulal de kha CLC atrang is Pakistan atang CLC ra in mukhom na atel tuina ran chok so ani khanin Mizoram ak omchungin kansipaite operation thom kashachake ati awangin is lungdara sipai ron in kul Gorkha regiment ho zan khatpola riak lo sikul muna ron in kul omnat fungfe po la in rohman firman lo ho kha khang ho kha kudan thak ta anni khanin asoko ka ko kha anan hal tamei anga ngai the te po ta engon ise pulal de hian in het yang en lo ti tak tak nge ti tak tak lo ti lai chu kan thra to lo chan chu mi thi to te hi an thil soi ti ran ol a chu thil om dan ani chan chu sia le is lundar chu coin nai te ni hela in mu khom tur in mu khom pui nei tur an ni la ya an ko thren oma boro le lo nei kha an security po chelek thei ani mar chu ni kha an achana han de tin ma feli po hian pulal de hi na de tak main fiction mang hian fiction kal sang hian aron challenge aron charge te ti a fiction kal tanga midang han charge hi midang ti lo dan ko ani big lo ku James do kuma renomin ti anga te khan kok tu pakhat ka moi an ti an ka lum anu tra na chon lal de anga wangin mo shom zong kan mom ti hang ti te ani alo tiang ve she phi kan van re thei pa ve kan van wan woi về mà thì tôi có trả là mình thì ta lên nó mà chọn fiction à chọn creative writing à chọn tu James Doku mà hiện approach writing pang ai chọn cái tiếng cái gì đó học lo chọn cho mà của ram mui lui anh deputy speaker din huna tôi có loading to anh amar cho creative writing à chọn in kan character te ka eng po kan soi tu thei ani aziak tu sei ni to lo a character sei ani to wangin chulai chu in defense na a ta emponi se ma feli po hian khatiang advantage a kharlan mang ani pe me ya tin hemi le kabu hian thuam khungi ti te ka moi te ang te kha sipayan lo in mut pui ti ra khang te kha adem shan lo wa ram le nam ta na impact na angai ani chan chu thuam khumi te ka moi te kha MNA volunteer chen khatin so an demand an pek lo chuan ko halan ron bo si an ni nula rol khan ba pek tuman tan na kalkunga sipayan lo duty si khang pot peng tu khan an mani taksa kha an pumpe ka ngai ta ti te kha kan hu poka thil tam tak aron chok chuak ma felian chung zinga thil pani khatle an share le cha ka chuta chuanin dark wi le anu te income na anita dark wi chuan kanu in ngai anga ngai hi har ka ti tlak ani an tor na chu kalai net be tho ma se kan khotlang in kan siat puina zong hi min rul thein karing to lo ba ka kami mal ming hliam na ti engtin nge an ron thual mam le te lu lang ni an mania wa kan thin lung thabar thin na te tu na ngei po hian tin alo nial thunga zeli po chon a trenu ril ru thiam takhian ani chi alom kan ram thatna turin rammu ma se an ram mu chunga kan ram le nam tor na zoza hi siam that le ar sa to ngiang ang chu ami mal tak pon tuar an tam e masin alo ti fe a ti a an ko kang al hu lo is lungdar ko kang al hu lo de kam mi thla mureng chungin independence lom na roi pui an chetanga an unaw pa an pasal an pa sipai kutura boral ta te tharau ngai to chungin lom na no pui an domanga an taksa dim na le mangai na tel hau lova du to kanom chenan an man lai te kha ngai to chungin independence lomin an la mang mo chu chu thil har sak tak an nge ang le ma se an chowa an rima an rim thluwa an ka pok to tlat a kele thei ani to lo chu wain an torna chi sang mitha mu chungin independence lomna roi chu an kil nge angai ani chu hun chu engtika tak thengang mo an nunna thiam hlimna le in le lo zong an hlanna independence chu an don lo ti reng volunteer le khotwal mi te chuan an reng silo ti te kan hu bok ta hei hi ekponi se ahun lai thil thlengte soilem lo te tar chuna anita a mafeli hian he angchi issue thren khatte kha angchi kha logical argument mangin aron chop chuaka a chan na chu a chiar tu te chana tan aron da zel het tak hianin tongkam mang hriam em a is lungdar to na te abo rok te than thumangin min shilian thatna anei ve bok achan chu MNF narrative chau hi thil tak tak zirna ta na i rin na kha rem chang lo ti te min tir boka thil tak tak zir chok tu chan thil hi aton to na zir angai nei ti te kha min mu chu tir min zir chu tir atum chu ani tel bok ani ti chuan bu to le taila apalina chon ma fa athi na thangwal a hi soi ka char le dewa hei hi sahi soma ati chu ani a vai na vatriana khan atel nge atin English point le lin ani a contemporary short stories from Mizoram dia khan mutur bok hei hi uthanga Mizo Union Councillor chungchang chunga thil thleng short stories ani uthanga hi ni Mizo Union independence mu injing lo party ani kha chuanin independence of an pui lo ani sang ka ko som ru paru malama khanin state khan lo demand to poni se ti khanin an on la choka volunteer den an ina trangin aizola an ina trangin tlang muama an ina trangin in tikher te ang lunglenga te korini ma te anwa lungphuna an tan tira sikula ama hi morse code eng torchlight mga inbiak na mga an mila siang MNF mile sa isam thum chuang man tir tua an tua andu angin anti lei theilowa lei an lai kwara fit thum vela thu ka khata khanin thum velan tan tira an do pa an chu chala an simbudoya an mai sa ma se in puang lo in puan tur anei lo ani eng angpon mintima ula kazalen na chu in ko kir thei chuang lawang eng ang point min soi sama ula ka ngai dan chu min sok son tir chuang lawang ti chu athu soi chun ani omzia chu the old man and the Santiago and chungchang kan huwa khani a man can be destroyed but not defeated kan ti khami concept chi aka helaya ko hen ma fana minran mu tir chu ani than thu tam jok chu atira ain kana atopa me khina ni atopa intran te pom amara chu he than thu thina thangwal than thu ero hi chu a intran na hela intran hanti na tu like omlo atop na po omlo bani ma fana creative writing mang uthanga min enti rahi ani na taka chun ama pu anu pa ani apu chunga thil seng chungchanga hian dem tur zong khan lawa avui pui hek lawa a chiar tu te tan ngai to chun zom na tur space zam tak ero min siam sak thung ani chu thu na chu keima ani a share tu te na kan siam mei tu ani hemi thon thu tamzok chu atira intrana topa to mechin ti lai pak pi lama he than tu bi ka chu a intrana omlo atom na po omlo ti lai kha ani na ram sai du pakhat chu ani bokta a vui pui lawa amar chu ngai to chunjam tu min pe han ti ang chi ati ka he la ya stray incident akha khati ang chi kha thil tam ta ka thleng ve ani ti kham min ngai to chu ti lo thei lo ani chon apanga na chon pizari zar boi bi vanlar zari chuncha nga hi hansui le ka du ani hi ramboi kumsom ni chunga dam chung tang tura mizo mechia an convict chun ani kumsang ka zakwa samsari panga January tha IGP ba ka top official pani an ka pluma MNF lamin MNF ina an ka alum pathum jinga pani IPS ani nge ani ka khani Mizoram main lo India ram angor hinga hemi kai hoya hian zari bi wanal zari hi manve ani hi IGP officer type sa thoklai ani achala hian thungan ko to pani chu January sangka jako samsari panga anmana nisom pali bongton brigade ani chu minu chon zema ko CRPF muna February atranga akumle July tha thing and akum khatle chan vedon CRPF kuta zema ko umle chu minu chon New Jail amve atuna district jail kan kita ka kwan anda le heta hian July sangka jako samsari pro patanga January sangka jako samsari pasari thing an tantir vele a hemi an tantir na huna hian an trial ngala an convict ngala atan tak na ero tespur jail ani tespur jail ko ti kalngai ani ta asama heta hian December sangka jako somriat thing omani December sangka jako somriat hian Silonga Mizo Student Union hawin ake sa hin fight sa Supreme Court atian apila aya ding to upil ten ko isaka Mizoram ale mundang ate upil ro imantak ha anton sa katin kanan fight na sa atin binangpon at sanchin hin mai vendewa hemi bongko na ni sompali bongkon brigada andala nan hai sanas sa le chunzan in aha te po kha anging de uvek ani tin zemabo ka CRPF keman omlahen kutkol le ke kol anbun ti khina tuk ver te po kha ommang lawani andana inte akhan tiang chuanin shom takin an da amvenga New Zealand anda po hian kutkol khan la bun tir tho ba ka asela khanin tiang khan an da to pa chunlama hian warden me chi order ni ten tia wardress ten tia kha ang chi khanin aron changin aron country la tilawa chon minang tang ve ten ko khan an india kan halawa an india don point hlaphu chop sa in zain an indexina tiang chonin ahun kha manga tin hemi test purjela han tanian atilam chon mizo tang ve an omna in ani kha an so zela an so ka ama cho mizo chuna ni kulam pang chu mizo ram nen sikle sa le kha chia khan lo dang lama a shin sel na te pona tour ema adu tu sam bera chuan mizo ram in sona ani lo point mizo ram arwang achan chu dam chung tang tu rai ngai wa khan arwang ru ro ta la mizo ram thum le ni thei se ti ta kha adu tu sam chun ani chu bak chu du sam ka pani khat bak ani lo ni Mizorama tan le Mizorama nge kan sikle sa te kan thifim Mizorama thifim handon te kha adu tu sam pani pathum jinga pakhat ani emponi se kumruk atang ani chu ramboi kumsom ni chunga kumruk tang ani ta sipai kuta omlaya soisak ani te ngai sak ani te ato na sadan tu te kha amma mina an shep dan ani pong sual ani ring po bitam tak an ani test purjela tanla hian mi pakhatin ming sang in watching le kha thon china sipaina an pong sual ron na sat thu azep tlatte le hemi CRPF zema bokan kolai te le mundanga te kha ang chite mut puya in phala khatianga lepche ta view anga khan aron china chutiang chu mi ina achan chin an zui dan tele amma an hriat dan le tu nu thleng ko an hriat zui dan ani ta ram le nam tan a impact na te atur na lam te kha chu beng khon a lo le to lo ani tin amma a hi ram boy tir khan aizola tranga ngo pan tan sia na khan emene pa ko han ram but le ka du ruma amaro churam chang chelo hemi 1975 malam yan voi ni ngot ram huwa lu ve tum he nge ni pos ni se amma hitia zela tan hianin tian atang mol top lova til mak dam nang de so bizarre boy story bi ka til interesting de so a experience te a memory zong zong te alo record vek many notebook te maintain a diary te lo maintain a chunga chon atil to na kha alo zia vek many ani case bi ka chon memory hi history recorder ania in personal document ani book ani amalama kan sei to tan amalama kan sei to pakhat ero khachu atan chon memory kha a painful a traumatic kanti like han hemi case a chon history recorder ani a personal document alone ni take ani engkoni se unri tak achan chin saizu omlovin abo pila amara atlom ta ina emo a voiceless voice hi ra be lenin om ta ina ni shanlo mzp wa history department dr azwali hian phd research aman sak tin anu zela po hemi seminar na te achan chin hi asoi zo zo tu nai kan zuban in an project dr azwali bizarre boy they relate notebook based in voices behind birth episode women's prison writing the head some levels ha anti chu so nge so chair du te kanom chonin share ko we lot in dr azwali po hian share we karing lot in dr azwali le bizarre poite hanin tondana po hi interesting de pakhat om atirin bizarre akom ti lampang hian a in hong lem lo tin diary le notebook ani le lo te poi azor thin asoi du lo nge asoi lem lo ani ananin kom tlang ne no voi ni voi tung bel anin kom no so ti hian a notebook maintain tu te actually anu diary avon to the poi ashin to zela achan chumi tam takin ama an shet chak chu sipai ko ta omlai sei sak ta te ngai sakan idan te pong suala ni am ti te ka an shet chak zo ani khami pi lam pang thil kha an tui pui le to si lo lai kan reserve chin kha alo india amar chu dr azwali hian in ti hian in the zari story bohle na omme to rahi aron pai chu tin tuna hian project angin kan ne adai ri hi tumthar ate chung kan ti chu sakman to me theya pakhat team khatin english nan translate ta team dangin yan amizo train ani na in kan ti so chu abu ti chu te kan tuma kan ti chu te am chu tumthar a chuan ekponi se khang kan sei tak ramboi lai tharum thona helen na ang chi violence kan sei tanwala conflict situation na emo context danga violence athen chuan perpetrator culprit ama an ale lama victim an zela khang victim voice ka suppress mo oppress ani china ni an voice ka ari achok play te lo china complete silence hi china main lo in chi non le na ni chung chu ani lai chun voice ero chu nun na petu ani thung ani athita te kha anon nung le ta ti na le lo an story akha shet turin aron a mi ten penge thudik ti kha anon shet te pani chumi kara chun politics of voice ti te silence te azira sil thamani ta voice ani na ta chun ara be the ani amara chu hunin a her so pui hun om thin ani voice chuan sei chuana au chuana tur mun platform amomo angai thatuan omangaya anthinlung ain hona tul bok ani ramboi wanga to na tam tak te kha atur tu te torna kha sei chu sak angai sei chu tu an mamo chu ta apoi mo per chu kan sei chu dan kha alani le zel ani hei tu nu a chon political forma tangten hanan sei thinna hop chinte pom chinte anei ta zel tin ram mului chan khat pe chuan in chan na saber angte tuana saber angte pon an lowin project make boka khatiang lam pang chu pe ni na kan han hamtel akha ani lowa chu wang chon ekoni se voice chu instrument ani theya vehicle ani theya medium ani theya apoi mo ber chu meaning pe kha a goal chu ni ta om ja chu voice is the power of the powerless ni ta chuan atom nan kan sei to tak le kan sei mai tam tak kha ang khanin recognition and mo Ramboy studies kan ti chang mo Ramboy literature kan ti chang mo emi human rights literature kan ti chang mo an out so kuya ka recognition tan pek thina platform chunita Ramboy literature atomnan tak Ramboy literature le kabu boy puiti lai PhD ka ti lai khanin ni MZT wa English department of PTO ne kan sai china anni ngai dana chuan hediang sai chui alang mal tu kum samngatal liam le phot set pontifin ani mar so sei hun hi a chuang lo tu hi a sei hun nin ka hria chuwang chon hediang lam pam a hianin mai tuana tu poi mang la MNF narrative sam chon nan MNF narratives poi awam bezel it poi shtai la choime chu du to ta ila okay thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Opia, for the insightful talk. Angay nung kantitangin ka siya. And I think the talk really asserts the role of literature as a significant platform for the minority groups and marginalized communities. And the paper takes us back into the turbulent times of Ramboy, and particularly in regard to the suffering of women and how memory is being engaged with in different ways by the victims. And the focus on the female body as a site of battleground in times of conflict is really significant as well. And I think the effort made by our resource person is also really worth is very notable, particularly in regard to the story of Kong Karmoy. I think it's one of the most emotional section in his book Ramboy Literature, and I would just like to applaud Dr. Opia for being the voice of the voiceless through his invaluable research and literary works. And I think the topic also really does justice to his not just his talk, but his entire research contribution as well. So once again, Dr. Opia, thank you very much for the presentation. And if among the participants, if there is anyone who would like to ask a question or share an opinion or comments, please feel free to post it in the chat box, and we will address it at the end of the session. All right. So the next. Our next speaker is Dr. Sureshika Dishani Piyasena. Dr. Piyasena is a poet and a scholar from Colombo, Sri Lanka, and her poems have been published in various notable anthologies. In fact, she is currently working on a volume of poetry to be published soon, and we're really excited about it. Dr. Piyasena is also a former research associate in the City University of Hong Kong, and her area of interest include studies associated with gender, film, war, and violence. Today, Dr. Piyasena will be talking on the topic depictions of the female militant and suicide bomber in literature. Dr. Piyasena, if you're ready, the Zoom platform is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Is it possible for me to screen share?
Yes, ma'am, I think
if you could enable that, then I have something to share with you. Thank you for having me. I'm really humbled and honored to be here. Yes, I am international, but I'm also local in a way because I studied in Delhi for a long time. So I'm a product of Delhi University and JNU. So India is very close to my heart.
Ma'am, if you could just please bear with us, I would just request
no problem.
To, if they can make it as the co-host.
Okay.
Yeah, ma'am, I think you're the co-host now. I think you can share.
Okay, yes, yes, perfect. Right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the depictions of the female militant and the suicide bomber in literature. I want to look at, because today's theme was the human rights, I want to look at how do we deal with human rights with a person who is a killer and someone who takes up arms? These are not easy questions. Okay? There are no easy questions. These are difficult questions to answer. I want to look at the role of literature and representation, because we very often tend to undermine literature, right? What is its role really in terms of changing society, in terms of talking about human rights, right? It disseminates information, although people talk about literature students as story readers. Literature is very, very powerful, and it disseminates information about gender, ethnicity, class, right? It can change stereotypes, it can create stereotypes, right? And it influences existing ideologies in society. And power works through images and symbols. They don't just, they're not just symbols, they are embedded with meaning, and literature creates these powerful symbols and images. So I want to quote Sankaran Krishna, who says that whether we see ourselves as individuals or as social beings embedded in a nation, tribe, or any other collective identity, our sense of our past, present, and future is marked by various rites of passage and rendered comprehensible or significant through the device of narrative. And he also says narratives not only discursively articulates reality, but are central to its endless and agonistic reinterpretation. So it not just represents, but also it reinterprets society, it reinterprets a lot of things for us, whether it's gender, class, or whatever aspect the literature is looking at. So what are the rights of a woman in terms of a nation, in terms of taking up arms? Simone de Beauvoir argued that it's not in giving life, but in risking life that man is raised above the animal. That is why superiority has been accorded in humanity, not to the sex that brings forth, but to that which kills. And in gender, and in terms of war and gender, Mary Wollstonecraft said that women deserve equal rights, but they should not participate in war. But this is a much debated question among feminists and all activists. Do we allow women to take up arms? If not, isn't that discrimination? But then we do not want a militarized society. So it's a very gray area. Young women have demanded their right to self-defense and their right to exercise their patriotic sentiments, especially with in terms of the LTT here in Sri Lanka. Many women joined the militant uprising, and they felt very empowered. However, when they did join, right, there was a sort of a backlash from society. I'm quoting Rajini Tirangama. She was an activist in Jaffna. And she says that the tigers were all right till these women joined them. They have spoiled the movement and the boys. When I talk about tigers, this is with reference to the LTT, that is the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, with whom the Sri Lankan army fought a war for 30 years. So when the women joined the movement, many people in society felt that they were being distracted, or the movement was being spoiled. There's another, Adele Ann also says that in Will to Freedom, that Tamil society reacted initially to the woman warrior in a negative sense, as they did not like the new role constructed for the women. If you look at women and the nation, what is the right to patriotism? Women in politics are always seen as a wife or a daughter. They are never seen as independent beings, and their right to patriotism, or their right to be involved in politics, is always questioned. They're always seen as these sexual beings. Very often, for being patriotic, they are always being posited as being a politician's daughter or a politician's wife, or that they have gone through a certain personal grievance to make them join either an armed struggle or politics or whatever it is. There is always a rationale given for women joining, which is not there for men. And women are seen as a distraction within either the military or in the militants. In terms of Sri Lanka, whether it's to do with the army or to do with the LTTE, when women joined, they were seen as a distraction. Right? And very often, women, them joining a militant group is seen as getting married to that. So these gender terms still prevail, despite them giving up everything and joining a militant group. This is just a part of an interview of a woman militant. Travik is the interviewer. She asks, "You don't want a life with husband and children?" And Sita, who is the woman militant, says, "No." And she asks, "Why not?" She says, "As soon as you get married, you have to look after children. We will raise our children and grow old. When we grow old, we will die. There's a difference between that kind of death and the death of a fighter. Rather than that kind of death, I would prefer this kind of death. It is a heroic death, a historic death, a sacrificial death. Having joined the struggle, gone into battle for the sake of the people, going into battle, we are happy at the thought of our death in battle. So then we become part of history." And very often in the interviews that were conducted with male militants and the women militants, the issue of marriage always comes up with the women. The men are never asked whether they want to get married or why they joined or what is the reason why you joined. Patriotism is a given for men. And if you are a woman, you are questioned as to why you are patriotic and why you would want to join. You have to give a certain rationale to it. This is how gendered terms are being put on to the woman militant. Right? This is a poem by captain in the LTT. She the woman of Tamil Elam. Her forehead shall be adorned not with kumkuman, but with red blood. All that is seen in her eyes is not the sweetness of youth, but firm declarations of those who have fallen down. On her neck will lay no thali, but a cyanide flask. Her legs are going and searching, not for searching a relationship with relatives, but looking towards the liberation of the soil of Tamil Elam. Her gun will fire shots. No failure will cause the enemy to fall. It will break the fetters of Tamil Elam. Then from our people's lips, the national anthem, Virtona. This is a translation from Tamil. So all the signifiers of a married woman are being put onto the body of the woman militant. So marriage, having children, community, all these things, they still continue in the jargon or in the discourse that is used to describe a woman militant, which you won't find when literature represents men. The women are also not given the right to be feminine. Whether the soldiers should look like women or not has been widely debated. Louis West's her theory is that women are constructed as citizens differently than men, because rebellion against constraints of being a woman does not translate into a broader social analysis of oppression when women join institutions such as the army, because they are rather aligning themselves with the most hierarchical and authoritative ideology of the day, embracing the extreme form of masculinity. So they need to give up their femininity to embrace the masculine. So it is a complete male sphere in which the woman has to adapt to. There is no space for femininity. Another activist here has said that it is a complete eradication of femininity when the women join the militant groups. And she cautions against this because women have never fought for the complete annihilation of the feminine identity, only its recognition and empowerment. Because women have fought for empowerment, not to annihilate femininity. She's a feminist who speaks about women who join militant groups and how they are viewed, how they are accepted in society, and how they are supposed to be a certain way when they join militant groups. But I want to look at a few representations of the woman militant. Researchers have talked about how women militants are always represented in literature as this beautiful woman who has suffered, or as an unwavering fighter. This is Sila Ompuyavantiya's research talks about how they are looked at as either victim or as this heroic fighter. So it does not work in real life. It doesn't work in these binary terms. Right? And these stereotypes are being churned out in literature. It is very, very few books, very few texts which really go deep into the issues, gender issues or the rights of these women. The Hindi movie, The Terrorist, also is based on the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, and it is directed by Santosh Sivan. And in it, a woman called Mali, she's a ruthless killer. She's sent on a suicide mission to kill this important political leader, and she's trained to put a garland on the political leader and to press the detonator when she bends down to touch his feet. But Mali is unable to do this because she does not want to die as she is pregnant. There's a similar movie here. There was a similar movie here in Sri Lanka as well. A similar movie where you get the representation of a male and a female suicide bomber. And there in the woman, Nirmala, says that she gets more strength for the mission because she realizes that she was pregnant. And she says, if I can sacrifice my life, let my child also sacrifice life for the movement. So the two constructions of gender as passive mother and martyr are, as Nandini Sonaraja states, inflexible and it's monolithic. the political space has been narrowed down for women by these two constructions. Either you're a passive mother or you're a martyr. One of the LTT, this is interesting, one of the LTT publications carried a photograph of a Palestinian woman holding a gun and a baby. And the woman gorilla with a baby in one hand and a gun in the other has been used in revolutionary recruitment and iconography from Latin America to Asia and Africa. And interweaving these images of a woman as a combatant and a mother, it's so tightly suggests that as soon as the war is over, the woman in the picture will put down the rifle and keep the baby. This image is also meant to convey a message to society that she will not give up her role as a mother just because she takes up the gun. Not only will she not give up motherhood, but it is also a means that as a mother, she should take up the gun to protect her child from the enemy. I want to talk a bit about the representation of the suicide bomber. The freedom for the woman is achieved only by offering her body to the movement in an ironic circumstance in which she will not be alive to really enjoy her freedom she has given her life for. And the discourse surrounding women militants and female suicide bombers, as I said before, always attach to notions such as sacrifice, marriage, filial devotion in literature. For example, the play Forbidden Area, it depicts Urmila, who's the suicide bomber, and her escort is Raman. And between the two cadres, it is very obvious that it is Urmila who is the very faithful one, and she's the faithful one who is sent to explore herself, because Raman, they are not, it is shown in the text that they are not very sure of the man. And of course, they choose women because it attracts less suspicion, because the woman can get closer to the target. Now, why is it that women generate less suspicion? Is it because of the assumption that women are by nature kind and loving and peaceful? They would not kill. Why is it so easily assumed that women will not be part of a struggle in which civilians are rising up against the government? These representations are only means through which the public get glimpses of their political and personal lives. This raises also the question of the subaltern representation. Can the suicide bomber, who really expropriates other people's voices by her violent action, be termed a subaltern in the first place? Due to these complexities, it is not so important, nor is it possible to analyze if these representations are true, but to locate the sites of power and speech which produce her for the public, and which stereotypes they enforce or which ones they try to break away from. Is it possible that it is this attitude in Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, which is documented in Sharma's book? Apparently, when the suicide bomber came near him, he said, "Relax, take it easy," to the woman constable, Anusuya, who was standing there, who didn't let the suicide bomber come near him. And Anusuya allowed the suicide bomber to come close to him. And these became, of course, the last words of Gandhi's life. According to an eyewitness account, while bending, the woman assassin smiled at the woman constable. No one really knows what this inscrutable smile meant. I wonder if it was the suicide bomber trying to tell Anusuya that she should know better the capabilities of a woman. Or was it her moment of sweet revenge? Because it was later said that she was apparently raped by the IPK that came to Sri Lanka. There were many, many stories around these women, because we don't really get to know their identities. It is only through literature that we get to know them. Anna Ibanez says, when camouflage and intelligence work were required, their skill at hiding the truth and tricking the enemy was acknowledged and celebrated. But in times of peace, however, such behavior is censored. This is a poem again. Well, it's a sort of a performative piece by Sumati Sivamohan. She talks about how these movements use the body of the woman. She says, women, in the name of this soil, this land, we call out to you. Where is your daughter? She wants freedom. We go on with our struggle. In war we survive. Woman bearing arms, come hither. Give us this day our daily body. This is an inversion of give us this day our daily bread. The bread, the body becomes the offering. The woman can only offer her body. So power works through not only just culture, but also through these images and symbols. Ideas about women have been and continuously being generated through the power of images and what it's claimed to be culture. And if we take Hobsbawm's theory that tradition is invented, right? We see that these, it's assumed that these very old and accepted norms are in fact, they are created as the dominant ideology. And these ideologies and cultures have been developed through narratives. It is through narratives that these ideologies are developed. So because women are less valued, and if you look at Simone de Beauvoir's notion about how men are more valued because they are killed, because they kill. So women also try to go on to that level where they become militants and they kill, and they feel that then they will be given the same value. There have also been many women who took part in civil disobedience movements around the world, but they are hardly ever represented in fiction or in literature. And even when they are, as I said before, they are always represented as a mother figure or as someone's daughter. They are never really represented in terms of their individual being. And there is always a justification of why they are in politics. And with the amalgamation of nationhood and women, the focus is very often on her body and therefore inevitably on her sexuality. In the LTTE, women were first seen as seductresses who will lure away the men from the cause. They were seen as evil and within the movement. And they felt that it would make the men lose their sense of purpose. And that's why there were very strict notions about sex and marriage within the movement. And the discourse on gender and nation tend to intersect and are constructed by each other. Gender is very much connected to war and nation, just as much as biology and culture are interdependent and cannot be taken as two wholly separate entities. But the dichotomy between culture and biology, that is gender and sex, was initially constructed, says Goldstein, to deconstruct gender roles, which have been seen as part of one's inherent nature. So national or ethnic identity sometimes seems to compete with gender identity, as when women feel pressure to subordinate their feminism to a national liberation struggle or for their ethnic rights, as in the figure of the woman militant. Julie Wheelwright says that rebellion against the constraints of being a woman does not translate into broader social analysis or oppression when women join institutions such as the army, because they are rather aligning themselves with the most hierarchical and authoritative ideology of the day. This is I would like to read a few lines to end my lecture. This is a short story called Appointment with Rajiv Gandhi. We get an insight into the mind of the suicide bomber. And the writer has written this essay it must be read very slowly. This is by Charles Sarabhan. The day has come, but it's night. A few minutes after midnight, according to the watch given me. It's Swiss, and I'm told very reliable. Am I reliable? Precision is important. Everything must go according to the timetable, so carefully made that it can meet unexpected changes in his program. Handsome and known all over the world, one of the most important of human beings, smiling like Gorbachev and at ease with rulers and royalty. And me, a nobody from an unknown village, where time had stood still for so long, going to meet him. I must be good, punctual, and do everything correctly. Punctuality. It didn't matter when we were children, but then neither did I think I would meet a leader of a foreign land, the famous leader of a large country, son of India's great daughter. I must behave properly. Punctuality did not matter, though time and work did. The stubborn brown soil, which needed so much patience, coaxing, father pulling me on the road, and the bucket coming up from the well, brimful, slopping pure, to be poured out into the channel, which branched off into smaller ones, in turn leading to still smaller ones, all meticulously and laboriously made, reaching the furthest points of our vegetable plot. Sister and I would follow the vanguard of the advancing army of water. Sometimes we would drop a leaf on its inquisitive, pushing nose, freeing it. If it got stuck, excitedly running beside it as it flowed further and further and further. Also very far away, and not only in time. That would have made it easier. Didn't know either that other armies, real, very real in their cruelty, would come. I wish I could fall asleep. Wish I could switch off this video. The small 4-poster shed to which mother tethered the goats. And I helped her move it, but during the days that their dropping would be spread more widely. So here we get, insight into the suicide bomber's mind. And I wanted to read this to you all to show the power of literature, and once again to reiterate how literature can deconstruct stereotypes as well as create them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pia Sena. I think that was a really insightful talk, and I think militancy in Sri Lanka is something which is not very familiar to this side of the country, and I think that was a really new topic for us. And I think what's interesting is how the figure of the women militant is being represented in literature, as helpless victims or either as combatants who defy established gender conventions, and also how society perceives them as well. And we're really also looking forward to that poetry volume, and we're really excited about it. And I just like to request all the participants to drop in the questions and queries that they have in the chat box as well, so that the resource persons can address your questions at the end of the session. Our third speaker for today is Professor Brahmotkin Nair, and I think he has recently logged in. He is currently teaching in the Department of English at the University of Hyderabad. Professor Nair has made immense contribution to literary studies in Indian academia, and in fact, his book titled Literary Theory in Contemporary Literary Theory and Cultural Studies is one of the prescribed textbooks in our current MA English course. And his recent works include the human rights graphic novel published in 2021, Essays in Celebrity Culture published in 2021, and he also has two forthcoming works titled Alzheimer's Disease, Memoirs, Poetics of the Forgetting Self to be published in 2022, and From Discovery to the Civilizational Mission, English Writings on India, the Imperial Archive to be published next year. We're immensely grateful that he has agreed to make time for us amidst his hectic schedule, and we're looking forward to a very fruitful session. Professor Nair will present a paper on the topic titled Reading Rights, Literature and of Human Rights. Sir, if you're ready.
Thank you, Hannah. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, the broad area for the seminar is human rights and literature, and the larger queries which will remain unanswered, of course, would include what do we mean by the literary and what constitutes the literary. Literature with a capital L is defined as what exactly? We will leave those quibbles for another day, because those are not questions that we can answer here. Other better people have tried to do that for centuries. We do understand, however, that literature is an institutionalized mode of producing and consuming texts, that there is a certain institutional process through which certain texts get defined as the literary, whose features are described, defined, analyzed, and catalogued as literary and consumed as such. So that's not really what I propose to do here, examining what constitutes the literary, who defines it, in what way. We'll have to take it as a baseline that we all agree on what is generally understood, what we all conceive as literature, or as Jacques Derrida would put it, that strange institution called literature, or as he defines it, literature is that which allows one to say anything and everything. So that's not really, like I said, the subject of my talk. We will assume a common understanding of it. Much more narrowly focused is, what do we use literature for? And I use the term use in double quotes, because it's not like an instrumental value alone. Well, the primary definition for a symposium of this sort is that what it means to be human, what the human ought to be, and what the human deserves is acquired through cultural texts. what do I mean by this? Models of the human, the non-human, the inhuman are drawn in certain cultural texts. Hannah, would you ask others to mute? I'm getting some static on my... Yeah. So the cultural text or cultural text puts together definitions of what it means to be human, what ought to be called human, what deserves to be termed human, in contrast with those who are deemed to be non-human, the abhuman or the subhuman. Cultural texts produce a social imaginary around the idea of the human itself. Now, you will at this point make a valid objection, and I'll address that for a couple of minutes. One, why is this the job of literature to do? Given the fact that human rights is very obviously a political science subject, where the definitions of human rights, the expansive notions of rights itself, is subject to debate in parliaments. It is discussed by politicians, by the judiciary, by the legal apparatus, in other words. So what does a cultural text or cultural discourses have to do with the idea of the human itself? And when we say cultural texts, literature is obviously the much larger, much more widespread and more powerful of forms. So let's get this right. Cultural texts define the human in certain ways, and the query that comes our way is, why is this the job of literature when political science, even philosophy at some point, medicine, all of them are fields in which the human is defined? Yes, medicine is a very obvious answer, in which medicine sets out to describe what a human consists of. Blood vessels and molecules and chemicals of all sorts and all that, fine. So the human is defined, described, detailed, anatomized, atomized in all these fields. So what makes literature unique? The answer for us is cultural text, specifically literature, through multiple forms, tells stories as to what is meant by being human, and more worryingly, those stories where some have been denied the right to be human. And further, those to whom the very definition, the very category, the very label of human does not even apply. Some of you may remember that before the Holocaust actually began, Adolf Hitler had said in public statements, widely quoted of course, that I concede that the Jews are a form of life. I concede that the Jews are a form of life, but they're not human. In the 20th century, later part, when the Rwandan crisis erupted between the Tutsis, others, each called the other cockroaches and rodents. The Hutus and the Tutsis called each other animals. What is it that you understand from this? The very nomenclatural label human was deemed to be unsuitable for certain forms of life. And therefore, as again, to go back to Adolf Hitler, once they have been categorized as non-human, they could be exterminated with impunity, like you would exterminate cockroaches or rats or other forms of life. So defining who counts as human is a very crucial preliminary stage through which the human rights spectrum begins to develop. Human rights scholars, philosophers have argued that there has to be a narrative tradition in and through which the category human person comes to be defined. What does that mean? I just give you an example of a narrative tradition of genocidal discourse, specifically, where the life form which we understand as human is not deemed to be human at all. So the word human within quotes or person within quotes is a metaphysical category. But for that metaphysical category to acquire cultural value, cultural meaning, it requires a narrative tradition. And that narrative tradition is important because that narrative tradition traces the evolution of what we call human or what we call person, and those who are excluded from that label. In all this, please note the emphasis is on narrative. The set of beliefs, the set of discourses, the set of imaginations in the plural, through and in which the human is defined, is also the field in which human rights gets defined. James Dawes would famously say that human rights work is at its heart a matter of storytelling. The telling and listening to stories, the production and consumption of stories is the domain of an interdiscipline called human rights and literature, which is where we are headed. So on the one side, there are stories that define the human, describe it, speak about those who are not called human at all, not identified as persons at all. And then there are people who read and listen to these stories. It is not a coincidence that Amnesty International actually has a section on its website, if you take a look, on literature and human rights. And Amnesty says, I'm not quoting exactly, Amnesty says that reading fiction helps us empathize and recognize prejudice and discrimination or something of that sort. I'm paraphrasing. Now, note two sides of this. Like I've said, there's the production of stories, and then there is the listening to those stories. All the stories which involve the definitions of the human and the definitions of those who are not human invite a certain kind of ethical response from listeners and readers. They move us in certain ways, and therefore the literature of human rights has very strong affective dimensions. It's not like, say, an obituary column in the newspaper. Now, at this point, one further argument may be mentioned in passing, and that is, what is the role then of, say, our political science definitions? Why do we need to think of the literary as a means of all this? Why not read human rights massive documentation? Why not read just newspaper reports? It's a legitimate question. I mean, why should we read novels and why should we read the literary when we could read these ones? Those who argue on the side of literature and human rights, or storytelling and human rights, or the literary and human rights, will argue that a particular form of storytelling is necessary, which will be affective and aesthetic, rather than just political and legal. And it's an important point. It's not a question of just whether the human has been defined or not, but how the human has been defined. It's very important to see how the human has been presented aesthetically in order to deliver a certain affective response. Now, what do we mean by affective? It's an appeal not necessarily only to your intellectual apparatus, but also to your apparatus of feeling. So we are looking at a shift in the way we talk about the human rights discourses. Some of you might very well argue that if you read human rights violations accounts in newspapers, or if you read descriptions in the United Nations report or Amnesty or Red Cross reports, you are getting adequate and more information about human rights, which is not an exaggeration at all. In fact, it is quite accurate in terms of factual records that you can have statistics about gender-based violence, caste or class-based violence, or racialized violence. And let's not forget, we are talking in the wake of Black Lives Matter. However, the aesthetic and affective dimensions that produce the certain kinds of responses are not available in these discourses. That is, the definitions, the affective sketches or portraits of what it means to be human, or the obverse, like I said, what it means to be reduced to the non-human, is not available in newspaper reports or the statistics provided by the United Nations or Amnesty. This is the reason why the interpretive methodology of literary criticism, the interpretive methodology of reading literary texts, has come to constitute a discipline, or quite more accurately, an interdiscipline of human rights and literature. It is the attention to the aesthetic categories. It is the attention to the philosophical foundations of the definitions, of the accounts that produce human rights and literature as a field. To get back to the point I have mentioned on and off, you will again make this statement that, oh, but that's what our legal system does. Quite right. Quite right. It is what the legal system does. But let's ask one question. Would you read, I mean, there are plenty of people attending this seminar. Would you read the Amnesty report, or would you read the United Nations massive statistics of war or something in the same way as you would read a literary text? There's one principal difference that distinguishes between the literary texts, representations of the human, and the United Nations documentation of violations of human rights. And that is, there is no field as good as the literary which demonstrates the sensations, thought processes, belief systems of those against whom human rights violations have taken place. This builds on an early argument made by Lynn Hunt, L-Y-N-N-H-U-N-T, who argued that the rise of the sentimental novel in 18th century Europe, the sentimental novel, Samuel Richardson onwards, was essential for the European readers to understand and broaden their understanding of other people as humans too. What do I mean by this? When they read novels about women, working classes, Black people, and they read about how the Black people felt sad, how the working class people felt oppressed, the Europeans recognized that, oh, even they feel like we do. Even they respond to certain situations like we do. So the working classes, the women, the Black people are also human. In the 20th century, Joseph Slaughter's work on the Bildungsroman also made the same point, that when you talk about a child growing up into a man and integrating with society in the face of certain institutional or state or social obstacles, then you recognize that this growth, this battle to be human, is what defines the human. To imagine the human is to imagine human rights. That's one of the very, very significant modes through which literature operates. That it forces us, and I use the word advisedly, it forces us to imagine what would it be like to be classified as non-human. And let me give you an example from contemporary literature. And this is J.M. Coetzee's novel, Elizabeth Costello. Elizabeth Costello makes an important point. She's referring to the cattle cars, the trains carrying the Jews who had been arrested to the various concentration and extermination camps. Okay, she is giving a speech in which she says the trains pass through the countryside, and in the trains all these Jews are sitting looking very scared or looking unhappy, and hello, have I lost connection?
Sir, you're audible.
Okay. Yeah, I thought there was a break. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So the Jews are looking out of the windows of their trains and looking at the Polish people as they pass through Poland. And the Polish people outside watch these trains go by, and they make a gesture. Some of them make a gesture. They do this to show that they are going to have their throats cut. And the Jews inside don't understand why these people are making that gesture. They don't get it. They stare at them and they look at each other and all that. They don't know where they're being taken, right? Now, Costello's point is, if the Polish people had imagined themselves in the cattle cars for a second, just for a second, would they have made the same gesture? If they had asked themselves this question, what is it like to be in a train headed for the concentration camps? If they had imagined themselves in the place of the other, would they have made that gesture? And the answer is clearly no. And Costello says, the Holocaust is a result of the failure to imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes. Because the failure to imagine means you do not have a sympathy for the other person. The Holocaust is the failure of the sympathetic imagination. Because You are unable to. And she says, there are no bounds to the sympathetic imagination. There are no bounds to the sympathetic imagination. What does that mean? It means if you are able to visualize yourself in the place of the suffering other, you would not endorse suffering. So that's one. The second point is, literature establishes a narrative, or more accurately, narrative tradition, where instead of the complete human, you have the broken human, the dehumanized human, the abhuman. It concerns itself with those who have never belonged to the category human itself. Several years ago, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities and one of the first people to discuss the arrival of the genre called the grotesque, Jeffrey Galt Harpham, said, literature is primarily concerned with outsiderhood. And it's a good way to think about it. It's concerned with outsiderhood. In the discipline of human rights literature, we do not only get those who are human, we are also constantly drawn attention to those whose bodies are broken, who have been violated, whose humanity has been destroyed. Human rights literature focus equally on those to whom the idea of human dignity has never been attached. And this is important. It constitutes, constructs, and offers us examples of situations in which it is no longer possible to be human. Okay? It focuses attention on things like a broken human body. Now, what does a broken human body do? Think about this. In any literary text where the human has been depicted as injured, brutalized, violated, we recognize that, oh, under these conditions, it's no longer possible to remain human. When we read descriptions of war or genocide, we recognize that victimization and vulnerability are conditions in which it is no longer possible to be human. Degradation, exploitation, violence show us what it means to have humanity taken away from us. To go back to my example, take fiction in which you are, and go back to, say, African-American fiction or Holocaust fiction. What is the kind of human that is portrayed? It is a human who lives in abject terror. A human being who lives at the very bottom of the social heap, exploited, vulnerable, victimized, brutalized. All these texts, what do? They tell us that somebody has been denied the basic freedom of action, the basic freedom of thought, the basic act of having food. On the contrary, these are people whom we have to imagine as having been broken people. The torture novel, for instance, is a very clear example. And there are plenty of such. And one of my favorite texts, some of you may be aware of it, is Michael Ondiate's Anil's Ghost. So the important requirement here is for us to see that the literary text speaks about how a human has been objectified and dehumanized. Yes, there are political texts and legal texts that do that, but none of them give you the process, the mindset, the beliefs of the tortured. Okay? This is, as several of you will say, an effect of representation. Absolutely. Absolutely. It is representational. And to represent genocide, to express the conditions of being excluded, the conditions of being dehumanized, is at the heart of human rights literature. It's not only political representations and the politics of representations, but the ways in which you can get culture and the law to intersect to generate a particular kind of meaning. So a discourse of exclusion or dehumanization is central to our understanding of what we know as genocide, the violent extermination of people of a certain ethnic or community, ethnic group or community. When genocide takes place, or more accurately, before genocide takes place, please go back to the example I gave you of Hitler and Rwanda, where the Hutus and the Tutsis described each other as non-human vermin. The discourse of dehumanization legitimizes the use of violence against those groups. By degrading the other, what have you done? You have used a specific language to describe the other. You have used a specific trope. To quote Hitler again, these are forms of life, but they are not human. The language of human rights is as little as the legal definitions of human rights. And the language of human rights is best captured in the literary text, which defines, here is the way to think about it. When the Tutsis and Hutus called each other such names, you are vermin, you are rats, you are rodents, etc., etc. What have they done? They said, oh, in our language, in our discourse, you people are not worthy of being defined as human. Corollary, since you are not worthy of being defined as human, we will define you in some other ways. We are not calling you stones. We are not calling you non-living. We'll call you cockroaches. Okay? When we say that, following from that, well, cockroaches, yes, but cockroaches are not worthy of attention. Cockroaches don't deserve rights. Cockroaches can be exterminated. So you see, this seems to hinge upon how we define, in what language we define the human. Now you will say that I'm spending too much time speaking about language. But tell me, is there any other way to draw attention to force people to imagine the other, the one who is outside the category of the human, and the one who is therefore to whom human rights can be denied? Outsiderhood is defined in language. Exclusions are defined in language. So this is crucial. Dehumanization, vulnerability, the idea of the non-deserving human but non-deserving human, classifications of the social order, the very idea of subjects and unmade subjects. By unmade, I'm referring to subjects who are being reduced in their stature to something else. The focus on broken bodies, the focus on bodies that are not quite destroyed, but nearly there. All of these are exercises in language, and it forces us to imagine what would it be like to be caught in such a horrible situation. Now, there is a very clear link between literary language and the imagination. What do we mean by this? It is literary language which forces you to think in terms of how it is to be not given human rights at all. Okay? First-person human rights narratives, which is often called the human rights novel, will speak from the immediate point of view of those who have been denied rights. Now, the link between narrative and something larger as human rights has one particular aspect which I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about. Hannah, how much time do I have actually? Could you clarify that?
Sir, around 1 hour.
Okay, so I have some time. Okay, thank you. The point is this. We've been talking about language, we've been talking about imagination. But the ability to use language is not enough. What is also to be granted is the right to narrate. The right to narrate is more than just having the language at your disposal. It is the context in which the narration is possible. So, in the case of human rights and literature, it is the right to describe, to talk about one's story, somebody's story, so that the voice can be heard, to reference the human, the vulnerabilities, and all of that means there is a human rights speak. Human rights speak. It's a language itself. There's an explicit link between literary representation and rights speak, so that we all recognize as readers, the way in which we are being forced to pay attention to those to whom rights have been denied. My own interest has been in one particular subgenre of the literary, and that's the graphic novel. Now you will again ask, is the graphic novel literature? It's not a debate I want to go into. Many people, including myself, have argued that the graphic novel is a form of literary representation, and it's a very dominant form now. So now comic studies people will dispute there is something called the graphic novel. I don't want to get into these definitional issues, but I want to make a couple of things very clear. By merging text and image, it forces a certain critical literacy upon us. It presents a visible, not just readable, but a visible politics of denial of human rights, of witnessing, of trauma, and produces a certain empathetic, affective connection. Now you will say, well, yes, but these are not facts. Fair enough. They are not facts. the juncture between facts and norms, the intersection between facts and norms, is the intersection between feelings and form. The culture of human rights, and that's a broad term which Michael Galczynski uses, the broad form of the literary, in which, like I said, the subcategory is the human rights novel, is necessary because of one particular reason. It tethers the legal formal rights culture in an informal lingua franca that we all share and understand. That is, the legal definitions of the human, the legal ideas of the human, the political ideas of the human are crucial in grounding, in tethering the formal apparatus of the law in a lingua franca. And I have argued elsewhere that human rights is the lingua franca of our age. It's an informal rights context. It's an informal rights ethos because it appeals to feeling rather than intellect, to affect and sentiment rather than rational, conscious argumentation and legal debates. So the culture of human rights embeds the formal rights system in an informal lingua franca, which we all understand, participate in, exchange, etc. What's the consequence of something like human rights and literature? And I hope some of you will ask this question and we can have a little discussion after I finish talking. First, it generates an awareness of those denied their humanness, which I've already spoken about. Two, it provides a language in which we speak about the human and the non-human and those excluded from the forms of life called the human itself. Point three is it produces aesthetic and affective responses by its representational modes. I now come to my fourth point. When we say an informal rights ethos, which is shared as, like I said, a lingua franca, it means over and above our national borders, over and above our social context, the lingua franca contributes to a global civil culture, a global civil society. Global civil culture is the making of very specific publics, not public, publics, around the world, irrespective of geopolitical borders, on the subject of human rights. Global civil culture comes together, an issue-based network or interest group that comes to adhere and constitutes a publics for human rights, humanitarian norms, treaties, and institutions. This global civil culture can only speak, listen, understand if there is a shared human rights language, a shared human rights imaginary, and a shared set of representational methods of communicating vulnerability or resistance or rights or the denial of rights. You will say that affective, sentimental responses are not perhaps quite legalistic. And you're right, they are not. I am not for a moment arguing that human rights literature or the genre of human rights literature or the global civil culture of human rights imagination is on par with the legal. No, it is not. But you cannot have the legal framework but for a language, a lingua franca, and a civil culture in which the legal definitions of the human are brought to life, in which the imagining of the human accompanies, supports the legal framework. So there is on the one hand the legal, and then there is the extremely affective, sentimental rights literature, which, as I said, is driven by social and political emotions. This is precisely what produces what Untitled called a global-ectic imagination. Global-ectic, ECTIC, combining the dialectic and the global, a global-ectic imagination. Its global-ectic is the merger, like I said, of the global and the dialectical, and it describes mutually understandable dialogue, a mutually understandable and affective dialogue. It emphasizes connectedness, wholeness, equality of potential of parts and tensions, etc. The interconnectedness of suffering, the mutuality of vulnerability is important. There are local specifics. I'm not denying that. Please don't think I am speaking about the global civil society as replacing the local. No, I am speaking about the human rights literature. Hannah, I need somebody to mute their microphone.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We're fixing
Okay.
that.
Yeah, right. So the dialectic, the interaction of the local and the global is crucial because that is how civil society is formed. It takes the local and interprets it within the frame of the global. Now let's take a simple example. When you think in terms of the discourses around, say, human rights of the Dalits or women, the language of the campaign, the language of activism is drawn upon the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted in 1948. What does the Human Rights Declaration at the national level have to do with Dalits' rights in India? A global critical literacy, a global lingua franca around human rights is precisely what comes into being and becomes necessary through which, within which we understand a local condition. So I am speaking about human rights literature as a system of producing and reading texts that interconnects the local with the global, where local conditions, local vulnerabilities, local violations are interpreted within a scheme, within a plan, within a social imaginary that is wider than just the local, because it's the global human rights regime that provides us the language to analyze the local. It is the local that provides the example of the global language. The global civil culture of human rights can only occur to generate a global rights imagination via local examples. And the local requires the global frame of reference. This is the reason why you require a dialectic between the local and the global. The important thing to recognize here is that human rights literature may use local examples, but it's a global field. So you can use local poetry, local fictional text, local graphic novels, but all of that will still remain within a framework of the global. And our production of it, our consumption of it, our reading of it is a tethering of the local with the global, is a connection of the global with the local. And that's why human rights and literature is it is no longer possible to read human rights literature as only an exercise in local cultural practices. Thank you. We have a few minutes left for discussion as well.
Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful talk, and thank you for highlighting the importance of reading the literary rather than just the political and the legal in order to understand the idea of being human. And I won't comment further because we have quite a number of questions over here in the chat box. So should I read it out, or if you're able to see it?
Oh, it's in the chat, is it?
Yeah, in the chat box.
Can you comment on the representations and role of Europe in the context of contemporary? Is that a political question, or is it to do with my talk, or is it to do with the previous speaker? I'm not quite sure.
I think that's a question like referred to you, sir. I think you should answer that.
Okay. Well, if you look at the image of Aylan Kurdi, the boy on the beach, the 3-year-old baby who died while the parents were trying to get across to Europe, what did that image do? The image triggered an outrage across the world and said that Europe must do more. Now, it's an image of a boy who's lying dead on the shores. It doesn't give us an identity. It doesn't tell us the history of that boy. But the boy is an adequate enough image, isn't it? That's representation. And that's precisely the point I'm trying to make. The literature of a place, of a particular local place, of a particular village, community, is still able to trigger an emotion, a response which is far beyond the local because of the methods of reading. Do you believe that international borders are dystopian spaces? Oh, well, no. I mean, why should only international borders be dystopian? We have dystopias right here, homegrown, local. It doesn't require the United States or Syria to be that way. What more can be done to human rights representation? What more can be done to human rights representation? I think what you're referring to is what can be done with human rights representation. Well, I am hoping that what I have said today should give you the answer to that. How we read Mizo literature, its examples of violations would do that. Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement as it is now being popular, especially in Western society, is doing more good for equality, or is it creating more division? Well, any such, oh, I'm sorry, Hannah had actually sent me a message saying 7 minutes left. All right, thank you. Yeah, well, I did finish on time, I think. Well, there will always be divisions. It doesn't require a Black Lives movement to produce divisions. The divisions have already existed. That's precisely why Black lives are lost, isn't it? If there were no divisions, there wouldn't be Black lives lost in such brutal fashion, and there would be no need for Black Lives Matter as a campaign, as an activist political regime. So good for equality, we don't know yet. We don't know yet. But we do know that the fight for rights, whether it was by women in the late 19th century English European context, or whether it is the abolition of slavery campaign from the 1820s in England and Europe, whether it is the fight for emancipation by the slaves in America, in the African American literature, as you can see several of those, it is moving towards a different kind of world, yes. I'm assuming that the feedback link is not for me. It's there in the chat. Do I have to fill in a feedback form, Hannah?
No, sir. You don't have to.
Well, it's all here. So is the idea of human rights in reality reducible to belonging in a territory or jurisdiction that would recognize them as members? In history, we have, you know, well, yes, but my entire focus was precisely this, that if you strip a community of its citizenship, if you strip people of their humanity, then you can do whatever you want with them. And that requires a certain form of language and representation, which enables that discourse to be in operation, and which, so my argument is preliminary to, anterior to a political act of genocide, there will be a language in which genocide becomes justified. There will be literary expressions, linguistic expressions, discursive representations whereby citizenship, humanity, bodies, integrity, identity are all taken away, and which legitimizes, therefore, the state's machinery to do whatever it wants. The works and arts of it will be genuine enough to be studied in the future like we are of the past. That's a little presentist as a question. We will always find our predecessors as not having done enough. Our future generations will also see us as not having done enough. Now we accuse Shakespeare and others of several violations of human rights and dignity and things like that. The future generation will also do the same thing. That is not the point. You cannot write for posterity. You cannot write criticism for posterity to judge you. You write it so that the present day reader is affected in a certain way. That's all we can do. Posterity, we are literary scholars, not prophets. We don't know how we will be read. That's not our job. If we do that job, then where will all the soothsayers and the magicians go?
Yes, I think Sir has addressed all the questions that we have in the chat box. And just to conclude this session, I think it's really interesting how, as you've mentioned, literature not only addresses the human, but the dehumanized human, the broken human body. And I think this also explains the recent popular interest of Mizo writers, scholars, and academicians in Ramwai literature, which is the literature dealing with the insurgency years of Mizoram. And once again, thank you, Pramod Sir, for sparing your time with us and delivering a very insightful lecture. And I hope we have a lot to take home from that. And now we will move on to any questions, or if you have anything that you wanted to ask to the resource persons who have presented before.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
I just want to comment on what Sir Opia said. I think that every conflict that occurs, be it Rambuai or partitions of India, or conflicts that are inside or outside of India, I feel like whether it's religions or politicals, there's women body is always used as an object to insult the oppositions, and the violence act on women are not as individual, but because they are women, and I think that they're merely looked upon as objects and not human. And I think that the aim of this kind of violence, like raping of women and tainting women bodies of the opposition group, is just to insult the rivals and to belittle the man of the rival to which the women belong to. And if not, the woman body is merely just for their pleasure and enjoyment, I think. Thank you.
Sir, I think there is one more question directed to you in the chat box.
Oh, student budget edition. No. I don't control the pricing. I'm so sorry about that. Where possible, I put up all my essays on academia so that people can download it. And I think in many cases, I have violated my own contracts with publishers by doing that. I'm not supposed to do that, but I've done that. But entire books, to begin with, I don't even have soft copies of these except proof copies which have corrections on them. I don't have. Otherwise, I would have gladly done that. Like I said, that's precisely why I put up my essays there. But yeah, it's very expensive. It's in hardback, and there is all these Palgrave, Springer, these giants don't do. I've also tried to explore the possibility of getting it redone by Indian publishers, but it somehow seems to never work out with any of these people. So I'm really upset about that as well. So I understand.
Thank you, sir. Like Promoter just mentioned, the majority of his essays and articles I think are on academia.edu, and you can go there and find it for yourself. And now to wrap up our session, I would like to invite Ms. Rodila Ramoyi to give the vote of thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Hannah. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you, ma'am.
Okay. Yes, on behalf of the Department of English and the Department of Mizo and Cultural Studies, ICFA University, Mizoram, I would like to thank our resource persons, Professor Brahmotkin Nair, Dr. Sureshika Piyasena, and Dr. Sila Ompuyavantiya, who have spared their time and resources to present their papers and make this webinar a success. I would also like to extend a heartfelt gratitude to all the participants and well-wishers of this event. We hope that you have gained significant insights from the papers that were presented today. And I would also like to personally thank Professor Kesi Lalkamwani, Head, Department of English, Mizoram University. She has been with us the entire session, so I would like to thank her. And I would also like to thank our Vice Chancellor, Professor R.P. Vadera, for his unfailing support, and also the staff and faculty of ICFA University, Mizoram, for their cooperation. I think, that's all I can say. Thank you all so much. And if by any chance we get to do this, something of this kind again, I hope you all cooperate with us the next time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ms. Roddy. Before we close the session, I would just like to mention that the e-certificates will be available for the participants. So please make sure that you fill up the feedback form, the link of which has been posted in the chat box. And tomorrow we have another webinar on the border issues in the northeastern states. So I would like to invite everyone to do participate in tomorrow's session again. Thank you all, and you all have a good evening.